It's a pleasure to see regular clients of BelTransSat in this hall, and it's doubly pleasant to see new faces. The first meeting of the Infinium Intellectual Logistics Club is aimed at introductions, networking, identifying experience and common challenges worth working on, and of course, sharing knowledge and practical cases from colleagues. Ahead of us are 8 presentations, each lasting 20 minutes. After each presentation, you will have 10 minutes for clarifying questions. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. My colleague will bring you a microphone and you will be able to ask your question. Colleagues, let's give our speakers a round of applause. They may be a little nervous, and of course, let's give a round of applause to such a wonderful audience. And with this ovation, we will open our meeting of the Infinium Intelligent Logistics Club. Applause. And the first one. This hall will highlight the topic of developing a cane intellect and new opportunities for reducing the cost of personal transportation. The speaker will be Mikhail Dedunovich, founder of Infinium BelTransSat. Mikhail, please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I would like to immediately emphasize that we are having a non-commercial meeting. And in fact, we originally planned this as a kind of meeting of the Knights of the Round Table. We just couldn't find such a large round table in Belarus, so we had to gather in this, let's say, conference format. Nevertheless, we want to emphasize right away, please ask any questions. The most provocative, the most difficult, the most pressing, because this isn't a mentoring session, but an exchange of opinions. And the first thing I'd like to say is that, right now there's a big wave in the press on YouTube and TikTok videos about the 4th Industrial Revolution, about how it's right on our doorstep. And all this hype, am I speaking too loudly? I'm close to the microphone. It actually breeds a lot of distrust, because when something is shouted about so loudly, it can't possibly be real. But in reality, being inside these technologies myself, I can say that all of this is already happening among us. It's probably just due to the modesty and caution of Belarusians and Russians too. We're like, in school, during an essay or a test, writing something for ourselves, shielding it from the competitor sitting next to us. And on the one hand, that's good for our own companies, but on the other hand, it's not. And that's why, with this club, we wanted to break through that gap, to overcome this barrier, and to bring all of you together so that you would make fewer mistakes in your work, because the pioneers we've managed to invite here today, who have kindly agreed to share their experiences, will help you avoid past mistakes and find your own optimal path in managing your company's expenses. With the help of these automated technologies, which are not difficult to implement in practical work. And in fact, the development of industry-specific experience is just as important as building industry-specific expertise, which is exactly what we are engaged in. In order to make our meeting more productive, I will take just 5 minutes to quickly go over the agenda, what exactly we will be discussing, so that these interjections and presentations, where each person will speak about their own area, will fit into the overall framework of the technological business process that you already go through every day, from receiving orders to delivering your products to customers or stores. First of all, what we are going to talk about is based on a long history of experience that spans 20 years. Why did all of this become possible in the first place? Because like any innovation, it is not built on an empty foundation. There is always a foundation of long-term mathematical research, which initially belonged to fundamental science, and then gradually diffused into applied science within the industry. And in the end, we came down to earth. About 20 years ago, we started thinking about what exactly... There are a number of problems that seem unsolvable. And at that time, there weren't even such terms as smart neural networks. It was called correlation series. We outlined a number of solutions to these problems using this kind of technology. And the first thing we started with was, we began collecting data, all the data about traffic flow, driver behavior, and so on. And we collected it not as an average value, like the average temperature in the hospital, which is how navigation systems like TomTom, Google, or Yandex do it, where it's just a point on the map, indicating that there's some mobile app at that location, but no one knows whose hands it's in, whether it's a cyclist, a truck driver, or a taxi driver. And accordingly, such forecasts don't provide any accurate solutions. And later on, they're disputed by every driver. That's where conflicts arise, because the driver... If a traffic forecast for a truck is made as if it were for a passenger car, the driver will be offended by such an approach. Yes, you'll hear, you don't understand anything about my work. That's why the accuracy of this data is so important. And we've been trying to achieve it for 20 years. How did we do it? One of our companies, BelTransSat, is a transport monitoring operator, and you know it well. It was never a dumping operator, and that's why it had the ability to store this data indefinitely, and not just store it, but also scale up the obvious capacities to process the database, and to use it to explore various new mathematical approaches in order to discover interesting new features. Ultimately, as you know, in nuclear physics, there is an effect, critical mass. If you take ordinary uranium, even weapons grade or plutonium, it's just a slightly warm metal. If anyone has touched it, you might know. It doesn't even warm your hand. But when you reach critical mass, there is a huge release of energy. It's the same with all this magical big data. At a certain point, it starts to produce amazing results that are even hard to predict. That's why the first thing we did was collect data on the movement of 3 types of traffic flows separately. These are passenger cars, medium-duty vans, and heavy trucks. At the same time, we tried to solve a problem that we hoped would arise in the future, and it has already come up today, which is the assessment of drivers in terms of the costs they generate for the company. And not just costs, but excessive costs that could actually have been avoided. So is there such a concept? Fuel efficiency, maybe some of you have heard of it, surely. It's the ability to travel a kilometer with less energy loss, including fuel. And this criterion is exactly the quality of a driver, which is otherwise hard to measure physically, like with scales. Therefore, in order to solve this problem in the future, we collected not only the speeds at which vehicles moved along all streets and roads, but also the tiniest energy losses they made by pressing their pedals, levers, and steering wheel. Through their actions, because as we understand, it's not the car that creates the costs, but this magical link between the pedals and the seat, which is called the driver. And it's impossible to seriously talk about reducing costs if you don't influence this link. Some call it the weak link, others call it a partner. It doesn't matter. The important thing is that if we don't learn to influence this, and it's impossible to do manually, it's too labor intensive, we need an automated approach. If we can't influence this link, we won't be able to talk about further cost reduction. That's why we collected this data, and ultimately, what did we arrive at? About 7 years ago, we started building our first forecast of transportation flows. At first, they weren't very accurate because there wasn't enough data. However, even then, a very interesting effect emerged. In fact, they were accurate by just over 90%. Moreover, our clients kept shaking us up for a long time, saying, guys, it's great that you're making these forecasts, but what about transport forecasts are good, but what should we do about queues in hypermarkets? Back then, we had 20 hypermarkets in Belarus, and the truck would arrive only to face a 4-hour queue. So what's the point of your forecast if it optimally arrives in 15 minutes, but then gets stuck in this traffic jam? That's why we started collecting this data as well, and gradually with those clients we've been working with for more than 10 years, we started to see forecasts for queues at the hypermarkets. These are much more complex than traffic flows because they are often related to the type of cargo the client is transporting. It's one thing to deliver ice cream in the summer and quite another in the winter when nobody wants it. And accordingly, the ramp manager might put it at the end of the line, or the opposite. Preserves like Santa Bremor are needed, let's say, right before New Year's for herring under a fur coat, and frankly, nobody needs them in the summer. That's why this is an even more complex task, but it also has its own solution. It's all about a patient approach and meticulous accumulation of accurate data, which then produces a magical result. When we combine this data with the capabilities of modern artificial intelligence, what is artificial intelligence anyway? It's simply a smarter way to search for the optimal solution. So, look, you understand well what combinatorics and routing are. You could spend an eternity going through all the possible delivery options, and stores, and products, and vehicles. But even with modern computational methods, if you try to solve it head-on, it would take 1,000 years to get an answer. Yes, you would get the optimal solution, but by then no one would need it. There's no point. Artificial intelligence allows you, let's say, to immediately direct your search toward the most likely area where it will be close to the optimal solution. This is an impressive process of searching for a solution. That's why, in fact, we have arrived at financial optimization of delivery logistics. In this case, that's what we're talking about, taking into account transport flows, the capabilities of the vehicle fleet, and even down to the abilities of the driver and their willingness to work overtime. Someone needs to drop their child off at kindergarten in the evening. Another client needs to arrive between 12 and 12:30. For someone else, the temperature compatibility of the cargo is the determining factor. All of this is impossible to account for with the human mind alone, because people have limited capacity. Mathematics solves the computational part. Moreover, at first, we managed to solve the problem unexpectedly successfully. The task of evaluating drivers according to this most important criterion is fuel efficiency. The problem with all the main systems we've encountered before, including our own company, when Transsputnik also offered such a solution as eco-driving, is this. They were offered by Volvo, Dynafleet, Mercedes, and DAF. In other words, many manufacturers offered similar solutions. They all had the drawback that they did not take into account the complexity of the route. So somehow you need to assess the quality of the driver, let's say their efficiency, based on certain exceedances or permissible thresholds. It's one thing on the Georgian military road. It's one thing when the car is driving, and another when it's stuck in traffic in Minsk, and yet another when it's on the ring road, also in Minsk. And even though both are in the city, let's say the ring road and right here near Nemiga, these are completely different conditions. That's why the ability to assess a driver objectively with evidence and without much effort is so important. And so that the driver can't deny or dispute it, this was a very difficult task, which we managed to solve precisely because we accumulated a huge amount of statistics from all the roads of Eurasia. And the robot selects, for every kilometer of the route, comparable cases, about 10,000 similar cases of driving in the same type of car. At the same time of day, in similar traffic conditions with other vehicles with the same cargo weight and so on and so forth. Other drivers, and then we objectively evaluate each one by comparison, because comparison always brings objectivity. If your child gets an 8 at school, it doesn't mean they're the best in the world. It means they're doing great within the context of this class, under today's conditions. What is a fair price? It's a tender price. It's about making a comparable offer. To compare who has what price, also taking into account the evaluation of the person and the driver, among other things. So now I'm trying to briefly go over the structure of what we're about to discuss. Unfortunately, the screen is very small today, but I'll walk you through it verbally. This is essentially your business process, the one you see in front of you every day. Geocoding requests from 1C, meaning matching a physical coordinate to the address you have in the contract with this client. Next comes the analysis of the capabilities of your own or hired vehicle fleet. This is not just about the capacity of the vehicles, but also their availability. Some people want to work more, some less, and some need to leave work earlier. All of this is analyzed at the preliminary stage. After that comes the forecasting of transport flows for each street, as we discussed, and then we move on to forecasting queues in each hypermarket separately for each type of product. And then comes financial optimization. What is financial optimization? Let's be honest, it's often hard to understand what these fancy terms actually mean. So what exactly is artificial intelligence? How does it work in this particular case? Look, what does optimality mean? In our case, for drivers, it means giving the driver the most demanding, but at the same time still a guaranteed feasible task. To do this, you need to know very precisely the conditions in which they will be working, including road traffic. And accordingly, if we can do this, and this is a constant balancing act at the peak of optimality, that is what optimization is. That's why it's necessary to calculate very precisely the conditions under which the work will be carried out, and to find the most financially optimal solution that requires the minimum number of vehicles, so that no one is dissatisfied, no one is causing trouble, and none of the drivers quit. Next comes delivery modeling using artificial intelligence. What does that mean? Again, I'll try to explain in the simplest terms possible so it will be easier for you to ask questions later. Today, from our point of view, the logistics specialist is becoming the center of new profitability for the company. Previously, the logistics specialist would spend the whole day assigning orders to vehicles, get some kind of result by the end of the day, and then send out the assignments to the drivers. It was just as it was. Meanwhile, the warehouse was rushing, telling them to hurry up. There was still loading to do, orders to assemble, not enough warehouse workers, and so on. But here, the logistics specialist can calculate a solution in 5 minutes using this computer, and then become a strategist. It depends on them how much money the company will earn. In what sense? For example, the computer cannot go beyond the boundary conditions. The computer only works within the conditions specified in the contract in 1C. Arrive at a certain store at a certain time, for example, between 12 and 1 p.m. Hypermarkets try to fight queues by assigning time slots for each arrival, and it's quite difficult to get into them. And it's expensive for the logistics specialist. But after the logistics specialist has calculated such a solution once, finding the absolute financial minimum for how everything should be distributed, they can use their head, turn on their brain and say, listen, in that store, Maria Ivanovna is an excellent merchandiser. We give her gifts for every March. Flowers and chocolates for New Year's. If she's available not just from 12 to 1, but from 11 to 2, she definitely won't complain when we arrive. But over there, Sidor Petrovich, we give him gifts for 20 different roles. And there's Konyak, he's also a great guy, he won't mind either. If we swap out those frames for him, change some priorities, and once again make him recalculate the artificial selection. And again, and again, and in this way, the logistics specialist finds an even more profitable solution for the company. And if no one complains within a month or even 2, it means that the logistics specialist has applied their reasonable initiatives and used their intelligence. And for example, if there used to be 100 vehicles for deliveries, with the help of artificial technology, it became 80 vehicles, and then it dropped to 75. Thanks to the initiatives of the logistics specialist, those 5 vehicles or $20,000 a month that he saved, he has the right to receive a KPI bonus from the company, because the company would never have achieved this additional savings without his involvement. And we make sure the logistics specialist has the time to focus on this. Instead of working on a part at a machine, he is managing strategies. Again, it's the same thing, let's say route density. Let's say we want to reduce delivery risks. For example, if he runs into an issue with his meter at the hypermarket and he needs to quickly move to a neighboring street. It's important for us to have a cluster of orders in the vehicle in the same area, but still keep things optimal. Accordingly, the logistics specialist can push the route density engine to the maximum, but then there will be a bit more mileage. Conversely, you can maximize, so to speak, the optimality, but then there will be a bit less clustering. All of this is in the hands of the logistics specialist. And a smart logistics specialist can take advantage of this all day long. And in the end, come up with a solution that's, as they say, finger-licking good. In other words, the logistics specialist is not replaced by artificial intelligence. It's like, roughly speaking, a calculator in the hands of an accountant. You can do the calculations by hand, or you can do them faster and use your head. Just like back in the day with 1C, if you remember. I remember back in the 90s when 1C was being introduced, people, especially older ones, and at first accountants were very distrustful of this technology. Oh dear, what if we all get fired and so on. But today we understand that an accountant has actually become a financial analyst in many cases. And that's precisely because the routine work related to basic calculations was taken off their plate. Remember the movie Office Romance, when a government office spent a whole month doing something? Or maybe you remember what exactly they were doing? They were preparing a single report according to Eldar Ryazanov's script, or rather his film. One report, that's it. This huge institution was producing a report for the ministry. Today, it's funny, just one button. But back then, it was different. It's the same in logistics. Optimization, sending assignments to drivers. I'll go over it briefly. Next, the top 2 boxes are about remote access. Mechanics allowing vehicles onto the line. This is the digitalization of the vehicle yard. It's about drivers being self-sufficient, not needing an escort to accept a vehicle. Like in car sharing, the driver photographs the car himself, takes responsibility, opens it with a mobile app and sets off. He doesn't need anyone to assist him. Accordingly, this speeds up the process of getting the vehicle on the line for our clients. This accounts for about 5 to 10% of the driver's working time. So, as a result, you need 5 to 10% fewer vehicles. It may seem like a small thing, but it already significantly increases profitability. Monitoring, plan vs actual comparison, temperature telematics, cold chains. What is plan vs actual? You understand that in today's situation, if you have, say, monitoring, the owners look at the map, there are 50 vehicles or, God forbid, 300 vehicles. It seems like they're all under supervision, but that's just an illusion of control. The system itself doesn't know which car was supposed to go where, and it doesn't focus the person's attention only on emergency situations. So this control, it's kind of there, but at the same time it's not. Because in order to understand whether this car being on this street right now is good or bad, you need to go through a lot of documents, calculate on a calculator where it was supposed to be at this moment, and figure out whether this point in this place requires some kind of reaction or not. This is also a very important tool to help the logistician so that he, just like with airplane movements, the dispatcher understood where the aircraft was supposed to be and where it actually was at the moment. Automation, plan, actual control, automation, calculation of delivery cost and delivery profitability to every point for every product. You can even calculate it down to a stick of gum. We have cases where we calculate the delivery cost for each point for every microproduct for our clients. Automatic calculation of payments to contracted carriers for the work performed. Many of you here probably work with contracted carriers and know, especially when operating in different regions, that each region has its own tender, its own conditions. If you take on a certain number of points, then you get a certain rate. The price is one thing, but if you add 3 more points, then the price changes. And if it's in this region, it's one price. But if you go beyond that boundary, it's another price. And for logisticians, up to 40% of their time is often spent simply calculating the exact payments for carriers, just to avoid any scandals later, because carriers can be sensitive. If you cheat them, they'll turn away from you and you'll get a bad reputation. Now, all of this can be calculated in 3 minutes. That is, everything is calculated automatically in the system using flexible formulas that you can configure yourself, freeing up the logistician. A huge amount, almost half of their working time, is freed up. Then the assignments are sent to the drivers through the mobile app. For what purpose? Do you remember back in Soviet times or during the perestroika or post-perestroika period how we used to be met? They still exist in some places now, but airport taxi drivers with their keys have almost disappeared. Those guys in leather jackets would spin around saying, "I know the city, I'll get you there." Now we have Bolt, Yandex, Uber, any student really with a navigator can take you to your street without a mistake. That's why, just like in that case with the high turnover among drivers, it's very important to be independent from these individuals. Because when we give a driver a specific assignment, it's like drawing rails for a tram driver. We lay out exactly how he needs to drive in a way that's financially optimal for the company and specify the stops where he needs to be and at what exact time. Accordingly, he no longer has any freedom of choice. His main task is simply not to crash into anyone along the way. And this, in turn, simplifies the process of hiring drivers and managing relationships with them. I won't list all the points here because many of them will likely come up later in our discussions with our speakers. Scanning barcodes directly in the warehouse, optimizing entry to third-party warehouses. When you don't have everything in one warehouse, it's important from a financial perspective to understand at which point in the route you can stop by a warehouse, so you don't have to send an extra vehicle there just for that, for a single pallet or a single box of something. Drivers are given the ability not only to make the trip, but also to record all their activities in the mobile app, so that in your ERP system you can see not just the orders, but also the current status of the delivery at any given moment. This is especially important for e-commerce when it matters whether we've opened the doors or not. Whether the goods were accepted or not, the justification, a photo attached of a scratched refrigerator or a queue at the hypermarket. What is the value? He can do this in any messenger. And today we already have this capability. But when he takes a photo, say, of a flat tire, just as an example, today, with the simplest editor, he can change the coordinates of where it happened, the time, the year, the time of day, anything at all. It could be a photo from 2 years ago, a photograph. But here, when he takes a photo in the mobile app, it is immediately sent to the server. He has no way to change anything. And that's why this is a photo document, which is then stored on your server. It serves as justification for his actions or inactions, and accordingly provides an understanding of how the situation actually developed there on site. There are built-in software cash registers. There is an opportunity to save on issuing them terminals, to allocate the driver's energy losses. And if it's your own transport, that's what I mentioned at the beginning. It allows you to assess expenses. If you look at any company today, for managers, touching expenses is a very sensitive issue. They usually focus their efforts on selling the product at a higher price. But when it comes to expenses, people are they're skeptical because they've been polishing this granite for so many years. If you press on it now, it might just fall apart. You never know. You could even lose the business if you just mindlessly squeeze this expense pie. But if you X-ray it, in this way, using artificial intelligence, it turns out it's not a granite block at all. The expenses of your company are like a honey cake with many layers. And this technology assigns a first name, last name, and patronymic to each layer, including for the driver. And accordingly, these layers are different. And if you start working with these layers, the cake gradually settles painlessly. So I wish all of us a good day today. I am confident that our interaction, networking, and the questions you generate will first and foremost help you find a more successful path in your particular case, which tools you can use and which mistakes to avoid. And it will help us develop our product more effectively so we can better meet your needs. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, I can address them. Now I'm taking a break.
You mentioned 1C in the 90s and how accountants specialized. And now artificial intelligence is developing at such an unprecedented pace, something that has never happened before in history. And it's hard to predict what will happen next, where all this motivation will lead. In the press, everywhere, in publications, a new concept is now appearing called on the right, another one. And this is having a very strong impact, including on logistics. And now it's already clear, even your solution, it is gradually reducing the number of people. In these kinds of operations, again, there is information, predictions, I don't know, forecasts that by 2030 there won't be any drivers in Odessa at all. How do you see the direction of development for your product and for this artificial intelligence, and how will it affect, well, in the longer term, our safety for drivers? Is this even realistic?
Thank you for the question. It's actually a very interesting one. I knew the answer to it, and it's nice to know that we're thinking about the same things, that members of the industry are concerned about the same issues. Look, let's think about this. The possibilities of technology, only those technologies find their way in life for which society is ready. Let me give you an example, maybe from some interview. I said, if you're familiar with aviation, I can tell you that even 15 years ago, any Boeing or Airbus could fly on its own, completely without a pilot. And aircraft manufacturers deliberately introduced limitations so that the pilot would have something to do, leaving the flight level, preparing the landing configuration, some small things the pilot still does manually, switching modes, for example, from one air traffic controller to another, radio communications, although the plane can do all of this itself. It can even taxi to the apron on its own, not just land blind. And this was already possible 15 years ago. But tell me, please, what about you personally, your children, or rather you also have grandchildren? Would you put them on a plane without a pilot for free? Let's say you're flying somewhere, I don't know, to Antalya without a pilot? Probably not, and I feel the same way. Now, if we talk about road transport, which directly concerns us, indeed, today there is a lot of big data. A lot of neural network training has been accumulated, including in America, through investments in cars. But why is there always the excuse that a supervising driver must be present? There are only certain roads where trucks are allowed to drive for a maximum of 100 kilometers in a straight line. Because if that truck, God forbid, runs someone over, would people really agree that no one should go to jail for it? And you see, science can come up with anything it wants. Let's go even further down to our meeting today. Look here. Suppose we configure artificial intelligence in such a way that it starts to vary the boundary conditions, which are strictly set by the contract, and begins to do what a logistics specialist does consciously. So, who do we hold accountable if the business is lost because of this? You see, for a manager, it's important that if the logistics specialist is the initiator, he's the one responsible, but he's also the winner if things go well. And he understands that it's like the saying, either your head is in the bushes or your chest is covered in medals, one or the other. And then he becomes an ally to the manager in making these strategic changes very carefully. But if artificial intelligence itself starts doing things back and forth, then who will be responsible for that? That's why artificial intelligence is always an assistant. If we're talking about a rational approach, of course, you can set boundaries for it, probabilistic settings, and it will start doing its own thing within those limits. Tomorrow, if you start losing your business in an avalanche because customers turn away from your product in favor of another, because regular deliveries are disrupted, well, there will be no one to hold accountable. That's why there are so many jokes on this topic, which boil down to the fact that when we dreamed about robots, we thought the robot would be doing the heavy lifting, some bricks, and say digging trenches. But it turns out that people are still the ones digging trenches. People are carrying bricks while the robot is drawing, doing marketing, things like that. The robot is composing poetry. Unfortunately, robotization is mostly moving in the direction where there is no risk. And today we are launching our transport into a society where children, little ones, are walking in the streets, and to expect that in the next 20 to 30 years, society will mature to the point where, well, okay, a child was run over, well, that's just fate. That's not going to happen. That's why all these conversations about automated transport, they are useful, they help the driver, they protect him from mistakes. But to fully replace it, a lot of time needs to pass in the collective consciousness of our people. Please, let's have some questions. Well, I hope everyone will be braver. Colleagues, this is not a commercial meeting. Go ahead, please. The more questions you ask, the more we can discuss together. We are not on opposite sides from you of the barricades. We all work in the same society, in the same industry. And the more openly we talk about our questions and problems, the more solutions and answers to your questions we will find together as colleagues. Moreover, we as mathematicians on one side and you as practitioners on the other, neither of us is more important. We are two links in the same chain. Without each other, we are useless. So please get involved, provoke us, put us in uncomfortable situations. We are ready for this, understand that. We want to hear your opinion because it is actually very important, because you can come up with anything you want in the quiet of an office, but when you were drawing on paper, you forgot about the enemies.
Mikhail, Andrei, yes. Tell me, is there anywhere in the company where your company is represented, where routing is done automatically, without the involvement of a logistics specialist, meaning their expertise isn't needed, where requests are automatically taken from Jaguar, converted into pallets, and then, based on the current fleet, everything is processed without the participation of a logistics specialist? You could put any Olya or Nadia in that position, and she would be able to do everything using your program.
I don't work with clients myself. We have about 500 companies that use this, so I'll redirect this question to our colleagues who will be speaking later, the ones who are directly involved in implementing this in specific companies. I don't want to make anything up about this question. I don't keep track of it. From my professional perspective, I can explain to you how I see it as an engineer, so to speak. If the task is fairly simple and the company is relatively small, for example, a modest business selling specialized nutritional vitamins for dogs with only 5 to 10 vehicles and deliveries that are uncomplicated and easy to manage, to some stores, not even to individual customers, then this can be automated with basically the press of a single button. But as soon as all sorts of unforeseen circumstances creep in, especially in e-commerce, when, for example, a grandmother might simply not open the door, or a student forgets he has lectures and needs to be at the university at that time, or someone is a mom. She says, I had to take my child somewhere urgently. Turns out there was a last-minute appointment. So these kinds of unforeseen circumstances will always create a lot of trouble for product delivery, and someone needs to handle them quickly, specifically through direct interaction with the courier. That's why someone has to act as a dispatcher, at least for this stage of product delivery. Or, for example, you work with commercial hired transport. Let's say Servolux, there, several hundred vehicles are loaded every day using our hired transport system. It's an army of hired carriers, each one for themselves. Someone didn't show up or didn't arrive simply because they got a better offer. Someone needs to quickly find a replacement, make a call, offer double the rate to someone. Who is going to do that? Artificial intelligence is about communication between people. That's why artificial intelligence serves as a helper to humans. It doesn't try to replace them. And this is one of the misconceptions that we are trying to break down for our colleagues in the industry, piece by piece, atom by atom, that there's no need to be afraid of it. It's just a helper like the calculator was for accountants in the 1970s. My mother used to be a design engineer, and I would visit her after school. She had a calculator that was bigger than this thing right here. It was huge, about 15 kilograms on the desk, this thick tube based with vacuum tubes inside. And it had those old, vacuum indicators, like the ones you sometimes see in old elevators, those orange wires. That's what it was like, that's what it had. And it was a revolutionary leap, because before that, calculations were done with a slide rule. With slide rules, they launched things into space, built bridges that still stand today, made locomotives, airplanes, including jet planes. But it required huge teams. It was just wildly inefficient. And then everything started to improve, efficiency increased. That's why today, for example, at Bulatzer, we have 7 people working, serving about 5,000 companies that work with us. And every day we receive all sorts of transactions. 5 people, and they're also analysts. Financial analysts, and they handle not just one company, BelTransSat, but also our companies in Russia, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. You see, it used to be different. Here's the building where we once rented space from the Institute of Welding and Coatings. There were 38 people in the accounting department for a total staff of about 250 people. Do you feel the difference? So all these technologies simply improve our lives, but they won't live or exist excessively. It's philosophically unclear, and physically it's hard to implement for various reasons. Thanks a lot. Okay, Len. Yes, please. Time.
Which you received this year is the 24th year. What challenges do you personally see when you are facing the director of logistics, the head of logistics, or a logistician in the field of transport logistics? Any company in Belarus. Here today.
I haven't gone myself yet, but I will go to Moscow in 2 weeks. Our colleagues are constantly participating in congresses in Russia. And all these problems are well known and clear to us. when they share their impressions from the MMLF and congresses like Trans-Russia and so on, everywhere the problem is the same. Personnel. There are no people, both due to the objective decline in birth rates and well-known foreign policy factors. There aren't enough people, and there is a shortage in all positions, from drivers to managers. And this problem is very significant. Most importantly, when they presented statistical data at the MMLF in Moscow, out of all the shortage specialties in transport and logistics, 67% are warehouse workers and pickers. There aren't enough of them. There is even less of a shortage of drivers than there is of warehouse workers. There is simply no one to replace them with. And warehouse automation, take Wildberries in Moscow, for example, when they reported on their issues, it requires billions and billions of dollars. It's such an expensive and complex undertaking. And in terms of maintenance, because it's not enough to just spend money on robots in the warehouse, there is a colossal amount of money that then goes into maintaining these complex systems by the suppliers. That is, people simply don't know how to buy all of this. That's why the shortage of personnel at all levels is the main issue. And for example, if we're talking about drivers, there are some positive trends here. By the way, speaking of this year, you asked about 2024. We didn't expect this. I can say that it was like a deus ex machina somewhere around February or March. Yes, for many years, about 12 to 15 years, we kept hearing that our drivers were being lured away by Europe, and our people, for example, someone who started their career with a Belarus tractor, knew that later they would move on to work in freight transport. In the meantime, he would drive 21st century vehicles for a year or a year and a half, then move on to work at some company like Primum, doing international transport for another year and a half or two, and after that, he would go to Girtika in Lithuania to work for completely different rates. And there, the Poles paid about 90 euros per day, and the Lithuanians paid 85 euros per day. And then around February or March, the trend reversed. Driver wages in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, suddenly dropped sharply. Obviously, there was collusion. In other words, this is what you would call a cartel agreement, or whatever you want to call it, or simply the smart behavior of major players. They started bringing in Indians and North Africans. They are building mosques on the territory of Hertika and prayer houses for Indians. And our drivers found themselves in a situation similar to what happened 12 or 15 years ago, when the EU labor market first opened up to them. And they, through these business religious companies that were recruiting for assignments in Poland, very much so. Back then, the Germans were shouting that rates had dropped because of the Eastern Slavs. And now our brothers, Belarusians and Russians, are in exactly the same situation. They complain when the Africans and Indians arrived. And these Belarusians of ours have nowhere to go, so they are slowly starting to return home again, and we can see this happening. So here, there is a bit of a positive trend. There is something positive. As for logisticians, people with brains, there will always be a shortage of them. I've said this before, and I can say it again. Very few motivated people are born in society. According to various estimates, only about 1 to 3%. There are few Lomonosovs, and the training system is important. Now, there will be a separate presentation by our colleagues from CONSEC about applying the consignment note. I would put it this way, if I may, answering your question and looking a bit further beyond it. If you just leave it as is, look, for example, you have a child, a son or a daughter. If you don't get involved in their education, just let them do whatever they want. Watch cartoons if they want, do homework if they want, play computer games if they want, then only 1 to 3% will grow up to be the most effective and successful people. But if a mother is hovering over her child like a witch on a broomstick, if she's constantly saying, Keipo, take part in the Olympiad and you will get this bonus, or solve this problem and then you can go outside, here you go, then out of 80% of people, capable individuals will emerge and grow up. That's why it's important to have a system of constant, careful nudging of people in the right direction. And this evaluation system doesn't just introduce grades, it's a system for teaching motivation. We spent a long time thinking about how to do this in a way that doesn't create conflict with people, but instead helps them improve, become better, and set the right objective criteria for them so they wouldn't feel offended. There is light at the end of the tunnel. Now, to finish answering your question, you just need to understand these trends and work with them competently. Thank you very much.